Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode UFOs over Los Angeles International Airport. In case you don't know it, airports all across the world are being visited by UFOs, and LAX here in Southern California is at the top of the list. And in fact, I've documented almost a dozen cases in which UFOs have hovered directly over this airport, starting all the way into the early 1950s, pretty much up to the present day. I will say that LAX Airport is the third busiest airport in the world, and at one point transported more than 80 million people in just 1 year. So this is a very busy airport and is among, like I said, the most visited in terms of UFOs as well. So let's just get started on these very interesting cases because I think they have something important to reveal about the nature of the UFO phenomenon. And the earliest case I could find occurred on July 15th, 1952. For 4 consecutive nights, dozens of witnesses observed unidentified craft directly over LAX. These objects would brazenly approach to within a quarter mile of the control towers and hover in place for minutes at a time. One witness was a major Los Angeles aircraft company principal who insisted upon being anonymous, and he wrote to the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper, and I quote, "I am amazed at the increasing audacity of the strange disc-like objects seen in the sky over the Los Angeles Airport Control Tower. For 4 nights running, they've been seen at the same time, between 7 and 8 p.m., and the same place. On the last occasion, 3 of them hung poised for 5 minutes by the clock." So that's the first case, and again, it's certainly not the last. It was 14 years later that another case occurred on April 3rd, 1966. There were several witnesses, including a helicopter pilot, who observed, quote, "an oblong object with several pairs of lights," end quote, hovering almost directly over the airport at only a few thousand feet of altitude. After hovering there for some minutes, the objects darted away. 7 years later, UFOs were back over LAX. This next incident occurred on April 1st, 1973. It was around dawn when several residents of Hollywood reported seeing a disc-like object glowing and spinning and moving like, quote, "a cork bobbing on the ocean." This is typical UFO movement. And this object was on a direct course towards Los Angeles International Airport. So there you go, another report. And it was just 3 years later when the UFOs were back over LAX. On March 23rd, 1977, a gentleman by the name of Mark Hogan, who worked as a cargo handler at LAX Airport, saw what he described as a teardrop or tin can-shaped object, which came in over the ocean from the direction of Catalina Island and flew in formation over the airport runways. The object had 2 fixed lights on it, he said. March Air Force Base, which is nearby, was contacted, but they denied any knowledge of this incident. They said it did not appear on their radar. They knew nothing about it, nor were they conducting any type of rocket tests. I will say that LAX is along the Santa Catalina Channel, which is a huge magnet for UFO activity. That could be a factor here. But in these cases, these objects are coming right over the airport itself, as if they want to be seen, or certainly are showing no fear of being seen. Another case occurred almost 20 years later, 18 actually, in 1995, when an anonymous air traffic controller at LAX itself revealed that during his 6 years of employment as a leading controller handling restricted airspace, he heard numerous accounts of UFO sightings and received several reports firsthand from pilots. And one of them occurred in 1992, he says. This was actually on August 5th, 1992. And as he says, and I quote, northeast of LAX, a UAL 747 on climbout at about 24,000 feet suddenly said, "Do you show something went right under us?" We didn't. There was absolutely nothing on radar. The pilot said it went right by us, opposite direction, about 3 times the normal closure rate, which normally is 900 knots. We pulled up the primary radar, raw radar returns, and there was absolutely nothing. The pilot said it was, quote, kind of like a rocket, but with something on top, and it was about the size of an F-16. I got on the landline to the lower controller to warn him for subsequent aircraft. The only restricted area had no activity at those altitudes, and there were no military aircraft in the area. We told the supervisor, and he just said, huh. We just shook our heads and mostly forgot about it, though the pilot did make a report on it, and it appeared in Aviation Week and Space Technology. This is a major magazine, and this magazine article actually described the sighting. As the article says, and I quote, the pilot and co-pilot of United Flight 934 with a heavy passenger load from Los Angeles to London said they saw an unusual aircraft coming directly at them and pass under the 747 by an estimated 500 to 1,000 feet. The incident occurred near Georgia Air Force Base at about 1:45 p.m. on August 5th. The 747 was at 23,000 feet, departing from Los Angeles International Airport on a heading of about 40 degrees magnetic. The several-second sighting gave the crew the impression that the other aircraft was a lifting body configuration, and they described it as looking like the forward fuselage of a Lockheed SR-71, without wings, but with a tail of sorts. They estimated the size as similar to an F-16. Defense Department and Air Force officials said last week that it was not one of their secret projects. So this is apparently just one of several sightings. This air traffic controller at LAX said that he was privy to. Something is clearly going on here. And another incident occurred around this same time on February 17, 1995 at 2:48 p.m. I actually interviewed this witness firsthand. He's a municipal park worker by the name of Brian Forrest. And he was on or next to the airport grounds on his normal route when he looked up and observed what he described as a large black object hovering over Imperial Highway about 200 feet up in the air, practically right over Los Angeles Airport. He said it was less than a mile distant, and it was very obvious to him that something very strange was hovering there. As Brian Forrest says, and I quote, it was about 200 to 300 feet in the air. I know the distance because I drove it in a car. The way I was able to tell it was approximately over there is a jet was taking off behind it. The pilot had to see this thing. I figured the people in the air control tower had to see it. It was shaped along the lines of a dark cylinder. Well, not a cylinder, more of a cone with a rounded top and bottom. Not pointed, but rounded, the bigger part being at the top, where you might think of it as an acorn-type shape. I would say it was approximately the size of a single-car garage turned on end. It did not move. It just stayed there. It was the strangest thing because I've never seen anything like that. Your mind immediately goes, it's a helicopter. It's a balloon. No, it's not that. And I just kept staring at it. It did not move. This jet was taking off behind it. Brian Forrest did notice another strange detail. As he says, The strangest thing is, I think about it now in retrospect, it's as though it was in focus but almost slightly out of focus. Everything else was clear as a bell. But imagine a canvas with fresh paint on it and you went up and down and slightly smudged it just a bit. It was in focus but almost slightly out. I found that interesting because this is something other witnesses have told me about their sightings. So Brian Forrest also remarked other details that UFO researchers look for, including the immobility of the object and the total lack of reflection. And as Brian says, and again I quote, "You just don't see things there in the sky without some apparent reason, something holding it up, or it's drifting or moving in some way. But just to see it there and not move at all, it was like a rock. It didn't move. It was like a part of the sky. It was the strangest thing. There were no details. The object was completely black, no reflection on its surface." So after realizing that this object was unidentified, he rushed back inside to get another witness. But by the time he returned, this object was gone, and he's absolutely convinced he saw a genuine UFO. As Brian says, and I quote, "It was like looking at a piece of the Twilight Zone. It was a real weird moment." And he did get some corroboration when 1 week later, the Orange County Register printed an article titled "Neighbors Encounter Unidentifiable Object," and it detailed the sighting of a dark, strangely shaped object hovering in the sky just south of LAX. And there were various descriptions from witnesses, including, quote, "dark oblong objects, a Model T hit by a freight train, or a piece of junk hanging from an invisible balloon." One witness gave a description that was pretty much identical to Brian's, saying, "It was a cylinder, black, turning and rotating in the sky." It was 2 months later, in 1995, April, that there was another sighting over LAX. And again, I was able to interview the witness firsthand. The witness is a lady by the name of Pat Brown, a massage therapist from Panorama City. She was driving along the freeway directly next to Los Angeles International Airport. This was around 3 p.m., so during daylight hours, when she saw something so strange and so unusual that it was instantly obvious to her that this was a UFO. She described it as an enormous golden sphere gliding slightly downward over the airport. And I'll just let Pat Brown describe this sighting in her own words. As she says, and I quote, "I was driving down the 405 and I got off the freeway at that Howard Hughes exit, and I was looking up at the sky, and the sky was crystal clear blue. And then, all of a sudden, there was a big gold ship. And it was obvious it was a ship. It was gold, and it was circular. It was like an airplane that was coming in for a landing at LAX. Not as large as a Southwest Airlines, that's one of the smaller planes. It was maybe 2/3 the size of a Southwest airline. It was just seconds that I was able to see it. It was obvious to me because I saw it. And really, on this exit, there aren't a lot of cars, so there was no one to my right, no one in front of me that I was aware of, and I didn't check behind me. It was just there, and then it wasn't there. And it was really interesting because it was on a 45-degree angle, like it was coming in for something." Pat Brown is a contactee, has had a number of sightings, and was visited by gray ETs and taken on board. So for her, this was, I don't want to say normal, but it's definitely something she's experienced before, and she was very much impressed that this was a UFO. But what really impressed her was this location directly over LAX. What is going on here? Why are there so many sightings over LAX? Probably the granddaddy of all the LAX airport encounters occurred in April of 1997, when literally dozens of witnesses called the news, called various radio stations, called the police, reporting seeing red lights over the airport. That evening, it was covered on the evening news. I remember watching the report. It was very tongue-in-cheek, very brief. They mostly just sort of ridiculed the witnesses, but they did provide descriptions from first-hand witnesses who described these as red lights or strange lights that, quote, hovered over the airport. And reportedly, they were seen on radar. So the reporting on this incident was somewhat incomplete and not a true and proper investigation. But they certainly did verify that this incident did take place. I talked to one witness firsthand. He declined a formal interview, but said that he did see the lights himself and that they weren't very bright, but they were absolutely obvious. And he estimated that they were quite low, maybe a few thousand feet high, and he watched them for several minutes before they disappeared. So year after year, UFOs are coming and visiting LAX. And here's yet another case, which occurred on March 31st, 1999. This occurred just after midnight when a police helicopter and crew were flying immediately adjacent to LAX over the city of Carson. And they were circling their target location at 500 feet of altitude when the pilot shouted out that a, quote, orange ball of light was an estimated 2 miles ahead of them and approaching fast. This ball of light raced towards the observers, changed direction, and moved at right angles. The helicopter pilot aimed the helicopter so that they could see this object and keep it in view. And as one of the crewmen says, and I quote, the object then changed direction again, accelerated, and headed directly at the door of the helicopter. And the crewman admitted that he was so startled that he pressed both the radio and the intercom and shouted out an expletive. As the crewman says, and I quote, the object got within 200 feet of the aircraft and then changed direction again, flying to the north at a very high rate of speed and out of view. This crewman is absolutely insistent that this was a genuine UFO. And as he says, I hope you don't think I'm a nut, but I've been around and involved in aviation for a long time. I've never seen anything like this. The texture, the shape, the movement, the speed changes, and the drastic angles all added up to it not being anything that I have seen before. So he was so impressed by this that he ended up calling Newfork, the National UFO Reporting Center, and reporting his sighting. He thought it was that important. It's another amazing case which shows how close these objects get not only to LAX itself, but to the actual aircraft. I mean, planes and helicopters do not approach to within 100 feet of each other. That would be called a near collision and would cause a huge investigation. And yet these objects are coming right up to these objects and hovering right over the airport itself. It's really quite amazing. And another case came not much longer. It was on July 23rd, 2002. And this is a really interesting sighting. It occurred exactly at 10 p.m. when more than a dozen witnesses, including a UFO researcher, MUFON State Section Director for Los Angeles, Mark Hunziker, all observed a large triangular-shaped UFO with red lights, and it moved directly over the southwestern end of Los Angeles International Airport, heading out towards the Santa Catalina Channel. Mark Hunziker, being a UFO researcher, was very familiar with astronomy and aircraft and the air flight patterns over LAX. And he was in Marina del Rey, just north of LAX, when his neighbor alerted him to the object. He looked overhead and he describes this object as being, quote, a brightly lit array of lights which looked like they were configured to what appeared to be a central jet aircraft. However, when he looked closer, he realized the shape was wrong and the object was covered with red lights. So not a standard aircraft. And more than a dozen witnesses from neighboring communities observed this same object, and allegedly one witness captured this object on videotape, an analysis of which showed this to be a large triangular-shaped craft. The final case I found was relatively recent. This occurred on November 27, 2003, when a resident of Los Angeles who prefers to remain anonymous was driving along the 110 freeway. This is directly north of LAX, and he was watching the incoming planes line up when he saw, quote, an anomalous craft crossing over the approach path to LAX. He says this craft appeared to be a very large triangular-shaped object with several lights underneath it. He carefully observed this craft as it moved northeast directly over the airport. Was so impressed by it that he later investigated all the flights that took place that day at that time and was unable to find any corresponding match. So again, he remains convinced that this was a genuine UFO, and he reported his sighting in detail to the National UFO Reporting Center. So there's almost a dozen cases. I know there are more. Most people do not report these sightings, and a number of other sightings could be listed because they were in the same general area. The Santa Catalina Channel is hugely active. So this is probably part of that whole complex of sightings. But what's really interesting about these sightings is how close they are getting to LAX. And I think this shows that UFOs are purposefully showing themselves. Normally, sightings are pretty evasive and not wanting to be seen. But in these cases, it's clear that they are sort of showing themselves off. I first covered this series of events in my book, UFOs over California. But after finding more events, I did another write-up in my book, Undersea UFO Base. LAX is definitely being visited by UFOs. It's been going on for decades. So I am pretty confident it's going to happen again. And again, airports all over the world are being visited. As far as I know, none have had the number of sightings that LAX has had. That's another reason why I wanted to do this presentation for you today, because LAX is really at the top of the list in terms of airports being visited by UFOs. But this is definitely a thing. Something is going on here. It's got something important to say about how UFOs behave, and that's why I wanted to do this episode for you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really want to thank you once again for watching. I really appreciate it. And as I like to say, keep asking questions, keep searching for the truth, and most importantly, keep having fun.